A 56-year-old man walks into a meeting he would have run a decade ago, and nobody asks his opinion until the decision has already been made. 64% of American workers over 50 report seeing or experiencing age discrimination on the job, a number that has not moved across 2 consecutive years of national tracking by AARP. 22% say specifically that they feel like they are being pushed out. 16% say it happens with senior leadership in the room while they are standing in it. The federal government received over 16,000 formal age discrimination charges in a single recent year, and researchers studying underreporting believe the true number of incidents runs 2 to 3 times higher than anything that ever reaches a federal form. The data does not explain why this feels like erasure rather than ordinary unfairness. Does not have to. This is not a story about getting older. Every generation gets older. This is a story about a particular cohort of men hitting a particular wall at a particular moment, and the wall has a shape that shows up in unemployment records, friendship surveys, hormone panels, and mortality tables with uncomfortable consistency. Sociologists have a term for the underlying mechanism, and it predates this decade by half a century. Status displacement, the gap between the social position a man believes he has earned and the position the world is currently willing to grant him. The gap itself is not new. What is new is how many men are standing inside it simultaneously, and how little vocabulary any of them have been given for naming it. Start with the hiring data because it is the cleanest evidence and the hardest to argue with. A 2020 field experiment sent out thousands of fictitious resumes, differing only in the implied age of the applicant. Names that read as older Barbara Walter drew callback rates 36% lower than names like Brittany or Tyler, with every other line on the page identical. The bias was not conscious in any way researchers could isolate. Nobody at these companies believed they were discriminating. The callback rates disagreed. A separate, larger field experiment, drawing on more than 40,000 submitted applications, found that workers in their 60s received dramatically fewer interview invitations than younger applicants with matching resumes, matching gaps, matching job titles. 47% of hiring managers, in a third survey, admitted outright that they worry about older workers' technical fluency, and roughly half said they would choose a 30-year-old over a 60-year-old even when the older candidate was demonstrably more qualified on paper. That admission is the rare moment the bias stops hiding behind a euphemism. Usually it doesn't have to. Here is the complication, the one that keeps this from being a simple morality tale about cruel employers. AARP's own data, drawn from the same population, finds that workers 55 and older report higher engagement than their younger colleagues, not lower, 65% calling themselves engaged, compared to roughly 58 to 60% among younger employees. Lower turnover. Deeper institutional memory. Every operational metric an employer claims to value points toward keeping these workers rather than discarding them. The bias persists anyway. It survives direct contact with the evidence that contradicts it. That is what separates a belief from an observation. An observation updates when the facts change, and this one does not, which means something else is doing the work that facts are supposed to do. So once a man in his 50s loses the job, what follows traces a pattern researchers have documented since long before this decade. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis mapped it after the 2008 recession. The long-term unemployed cluster disproportionately into 2 age groups, workers near 23 and workers near 50, and the 2 groups fail for different reasons entirely. Younger workers struggle because of the business cycle, a problem that eventually corrects itself as the economy turns. Older workers struggle because of their age itself, independent of economic conditions, a finding echoed separately in unemployment duration research published in the Journal for Labor Market Research, which found that as workers age, both the length of their unemployment and their odds of reemployment move in the wrong direction at the same time. The longer a man stays unemployed, the harder it becomes to get hired. The harder it becomes to get hired, the longer he stays unemployed. Economists call this duration dependence. It is a trap with no obvious exit ramp, and it tightens slowly enough that a man can spend a full year inside it before he understands its actual shape. None of this is unprecedented. It rhymes with something specific. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, deindustrialization swept American manufacturing regions and displaced millions of workers, the overwhelming majority of them men, in industries that had organized their sense of self for entire adult lifetimes. Pennsylvania's steel sector alone shed more than 150,000 jobs in the early 80s. Sociologists studying the aftermath coined a specific phrase for what happened to the men left standing in it. Class dislocation, the experience of losing not just income but the whole social architecture that income had quietly been supporting. British researcher Angela Coyle, studying unemployment in deindustrializing towns during the same period, described the psychological effect on men in language that has stayed in the literature ever since, what she called the unsexing of men, a description of identity corroding in ways that the same income loss did not corrode for women in the same households. Sociologist Anup Nayak later extended the idea into what he termed displaced masculinities, the social confusion that follows when the work that once organized a man's value disappears and nothing arrives to replace the function it served. Daniel White's ethnographic study of a deindustrializing town in central Scotland found something blunter still on the ground. Men there had stopped describing themselves as workers and started describing themselves, and being described as wasters. The wall today is built from different material. Office layoffs instead of factory closures. A LinkedIn notification instead of a foreman's clipboard. But the underlying shape, a role that had quietly been load-bearing, removed all at once with nothing engineered to replace its function, is the same shape historians have been describing for half a century. What's different now, and this is the part the data makes hardest to look away from, is what surrounds the wall. A man losing his footing in 1983 typically still had a dense social structure to fall back into. A union hall, a church, a stable neighborhood, a wide bench of close friends who had known him for 20 years. A man losing his footing today is falling into something considerably thinner. The Survey Center on American Life's tracking found the share of American men reporting zero close friends rising from 3% in 1990 to 15% in 2021, a five-fold increase across 3 decades. The share of men reporting 10 or more close friends collapsed over the same window, from 40% down to 15%. Sociologist Daniel Cox, who leads that research, has also published a complicating finding worth taking seriously rather than skipping past. In more recent surveys, the gap between men and women narrows considerably, with close to equal shares of each reporting no close friends at all. The male loneliness crisis headline may be measuring something slightly less gendered than it first appeared and slightly more generational, tied to a broader collapse in American social participation that happens to land hardest on men, because men had less redundancy built into their social lives to begin with, not because the collapse singled them out. Less redundancy is the operative phrase, and it survives the complication intact. Even in the more equal recent numbers, men report receiving emotional support from a friend at less than half the rate women do. 21% in the past week, against 41% for women. A friendship that exists on a survey form is not the same as a friendship that functions as load-bearing infrastructure. For a particular kind of man in a particular kind of career, work had been operating as an income source and a social structure at the same time, often without him ever noticing the second function until it disappeared along with the first. When the job goes, both fail simultaneously. That is the part the unemployment statistics alone do not capture, and it is the part that explains why the wall feels less like an inconvenience and more like a disappearance. CTA. If any part of this is sounding personal rather than abstract, say so in the comments. It's worth knowing how widely this lands. The invisibility does not stop at the office door. And this is the detail that gets lost most often in coverage that treats this as a purely economic story. AARP's most recent tracking found that 19% of workers over 50 have experienced subtle age discrimination at social events outside of work entirely. Not in a performance review, not in a layoff meeting, but at a dinner, a gathering, a casual room with no professional stakes attached to it at all. 37% report it specifically during the job search process itself, the single highest share of any context measured. The most common form isn't hostility. It's a quieter thing, an assumption, stated or implied, that the man in the room is less tech-savvy, reported by a third of respondents in both 2024 and 2025 without meaningful change between the 2 years. Not acknowledging accomplishments or expertise ran at 20%. Jokes about generational difference ran at 21%, small enough individually that almost none of them would register as discrimination if isolated and examined on their own. Stacked across a year across 100 rooms, the small things accumulate into something that behaves exactly like the large thing, just slower and harder to point to. A man can rarely name the single moment he became invisible, because there typically wasn't one. There were 400 moments, each too small to mention, that did the same work as one large one would have. There is a physical layer underneath the social one, and it deserves its own treatment rather than a footnote. Testosterone in men declines gradually from roughly age 30 onward, at a rate researchers place between 1 and 1.6% per year, according to the American College of Physicians. By age 75, a typical man has lost close to 30% of the testosterone he carried at 25, a figure calculated in a 2016 study published in the journal Virulence. The decline is not a cliff the way female menopause is a cliff. It is a slope, and slopes are harder to notice and harder to blame for anything specific, which is precisely what makes them dangerous as an explanation men reach for without examining it. One large cross-sectional study found testosterone reaching its lowest point around age 58 to 59 before a modest rebound, which places the biological nadir almost exactly on top of the social and economic one. Doctors are careful, and rightly so, to separate this from the layoffs and the friendship data. A hormone panel does not explain an EOC complaint, but fatigue, low mood, and diminished drive are documented symptoms of the decline, according to physicians at Columbia and the American Heart Association. And a man already absorbing professional rejection and social contraction is the worst positioned person on earth to distinguish a hormonal slope from a referendum on his worth. The two get tangled. Almost nobody is trained to pull them apart. What happens to bodies under this kind of compound pressure, economic, social, and physical pressure landing in the same 5-year window, is where the data stops being abstract and starts being mortal. In 2015, economists in Case and Angus Deaton, working out of Princeton, published findings that startled them enough that they initially worried the numbers were simply wrong. Mortality among middle-aged white Americans without a college degree had begun climbing in 1999, reversing a century-long trend of steady improvement, and it kept climbing for nearly 2 decades. They named the cause deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholic liver disease, treated as 3 expressions of one underlying collapse rather than 3 unrelated public health problems. The mortality rate for this group rose by roughly 0.5% every year between 1999 and 2013. Case later told NPR directly that the suicide component fell disproportionately on men, while the slower deaths, the overdoses, the liver disease, were where men and women converged. Her phrase for the mechanism has stayed in the field since: people killing themselves either quickly with a gun or slowly with drugs and alcohol. Underneath both, she argued, sat the same eroded foundation: poor job prospects compounding silently over an entire working life until something finally gave way. The complication here is serious, and the data insists on it. This pattern is not universal across American men. It concentrates sharply by education and by race. Hispanic and Black Americans did not show the same mortality rise over the same period, even with comparable or worse income profiles. A discrepancy Case and Deaton themselves called an unresolved puzzle, one they have not claimed to fully solve. CDC data through 2024 confirms the racial specificity holds. White men carry the highest suicide rate among all male demographic groups at nearly 25 per 100,000, while Black and Asian men sit meaningfully lower, and American Indian and Alaska Native men sit highest of all. This is not men in their 50s, full stop. It is a particular intersection of age, education, race, and economic disruption, and collapsing it into one universal male crisis erases exactly the precision the data is offering for free. It is, however, durable across the decades in one specific respect: age itself. CDC mortality data stretching back to the early 2000s shows men aged 45 to 64 carrying a sustained, elevated suicide rate that has outlasted multiple recessions, multiple recoveries, and multiple changes in which political party held power. The 45 to 64 bracket is the only age group where suicide has ranked among the leading causes of death year after year, without the volatility visible in younger cohorts. Younger men's suicide rates have climbed fastest since 2010, propelled by an entirely different set of forces tied to digital life and early adulthood instability, but the men in midlife were already elevated before that younger surge ever began, and as of the most recent CDC data, they have not come back down anywhere close to where they started. CTA. This is exactly the kind of pattern that's easy to miss if you're only looking at 1 year of data at a time. Subscribe if you want the version that tracks across decades instead. Retirement researchers have started describing a related but distinct phenomenon among men who have not yet lost the job but sense the wall approaching anyway: Job hugging. The practice of clinging to a current position well past the point of genuine enthusiasm, driven less by ambition than by fear of whatever waits on the other side of letting go. A 2025 Northwestern Mutual report found that more than half of Generation X, the cohort now squarely in its 50s, does not believe it has saved enough to retire at the traditional age of 65. They are staying not because the room still feels like theirs, but because leaving it feels more dangerous than remaining invisible inside it. Bureau of Labor Statistics projections back this up structurally. Workforce participation among Americans in their late 50s is expected to climb toward nearly 75% by 2030. More 50-something men in the workforce holding on longer than any previous cohort, while reporting less and less sense that anyone in the room is actually looking at them when they speak. Here is the editorial observation: the one moment this script steps outside the data to say something plainly, before returning immediately to the numbers, the rooms these men used to own were never actually theirs. They were on loan, contingent on output, revocable the instant the output slowed, and almost nobody told them that going in. Back to the evidence. There is a quieter complication threaded through all of this, one the loudest commentary tends to skip past entirely. Engagement surveys show these same men performing better, by the numbers, than the workforce currently replacing them. Lower turnover, higher loyalty, deeper expertise accumulated over decades that cannot be replicated by hiring 3 26-year-olds. The invisibility, in other words, is not a verdict on their competence. It is closer to a verdict on what the culture has quietly decided counts as visible in the first place. Proximity to newness, fluency in whatever tool launched this quarter, an energy that reads as promise rather than as proof. Competence and visibility have stopped being the same variable, and nobody sat these men down beforehand to explain that the rules of the room had changed underneath their feet while they were still doing the job correctly. What the data does not resolve and should not pretend to resolve is whether this moment passes or hardens into something permanent. The most optimistic reading points to the AARP engagement numbers and to a structural fact economists at the Economic Policy Institute keep returning to. America's falling birth rate is shrinking the available labor pool, which should, eventually, force employers to value experienced workers out of necessity rather than goodwill. Necessity has a way of correcting biases that appeals to fairness never managed to touch. The more sobering reading points to the EOC's own enforcement numbers: 16,223 age discrimination charges filed in 2024, up nearly 2,000 from the year before, paired with researchers' estimate that fewer than half of all instances of age discrimination ever get formally reported at all, out of fear of retaliation or a settled belief that nothing will change regardless. The real number could run 2 to 3 times higher than what shows up in any official count. A bias that persists even when it costs the people enforcing it. AARP estimates illegal age discrimination drains roughly $850 billion a year out of the American economy, is not a bias that corrects itself through market pressure alone, on its own timeline, without anyone pushing. It may take considerably longer than a labor shortage to fix what an entire culture decided, all at once and without much discussion, to stop seeing. What remains genuinely unknown is the most consequential thing of all: whether the men inside this wall right now are the last cohort to experience it in quite this configuration, or simply the first documented instance of a pattern that will repeat every 20 years, as each new generation of 50-somethings discovers, usually alone and usually too late to fully prepare for it, that the room they spent 30 years helping build no longer recognizes them as the ones who built it. The engagement surveys say they still have more to give than almost anyone in the building. The hiring data says almost nobody plans to ask. Both of those things are true in the same room at the same time about the same men, and the data has no mechanism for resolving that contradiction in either direction. Can only keep counting. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.